Talking sports business as we usually do on this podcast every so often. I think we've gone 3 weeks in between conversations with David Samson, the former team president of the Florida and then Miami Marlins, and John Skipper, the former president of ESPN and DAZN, and now the CEO of Meadowlark Media. I should also say that David hosts the podcast Nothing Personal with David Samson, which you can find wherever you get podcasts. And guys, I do want to start with the Super Bowl. It just happened. The TV viewership has come in. 113 million people watched on average the Super Bowl. A total of 182.6 million people watched some part of it, and 118.7 million people watched the halftime show featuring Rihanna. John, I give you those numbers, and what do they mean to you?
It means that the Super Bowl is the closest we have to a national reunification day, where all Americans come together and do the same thing and believe in the same thing. So 1 out of every 3 Americans was watching the game at the average minute. 1 out of every 2 Americans watched some portion of the game. I actually am going to take it as a good sign that Americans can come together on something, and it is football.
So you're going to get political and say that you had people from the right, people from the left, all in the same household, all together singing Kumbaya, trying to wonder whether or not it was actually a penalty. I guess my thought is this, that the majority of people, I'm not sure they know what the final score was, but it is a good excuse to get together and party. And so when you say they were watching the game, one of the things that interests me is from a business standpoint, this in theory drives revenue, as we've seen the price of commercials go up to what was $7 million and ratings, and it furthers the possibility of this becoming some sort of paid event. But it does make me wonder, to me, it's an excuse for people to party, not necessarily to join in their love of football and, of course, gamble, which we can't forget about.
Now, David, one of the things that we've talked about on this podcast before is sort of the ever-living jealousy of other sports towards the NFL and the way that they can create this. Is there a second version of this? Is there a second Super Bowl that you can envision another sport creating? Because it's kind of odd that, yes, we all gather for this one sporting event, but that we don't do it for basically anything else. It used to kind of be, Game 7 of the World Series, the college basketball national championship, the college football national championship, but there isn't a second one of these. And who is going to fill that void?
Well, what do they all have in common that you just mentioned? The Super Bowl is actually, I could argue, is getting later and later, but a 6:39 start on the East Coast at 3:39 Pacific. There is no World Series game that is anything other than after 8 p.m. The college football final, I believe, is on a Monday night. Close to 9 p.m. is tip-off for that game. And so I think timing is a big issue. Having it on a weekend is a big issue. But you mentioned jealousy. And John, I can't tell you the number of hours that I've spent in my life trying to get you to pay us more, and you telling us that the best way to do it is to get more people engaged and be more like football. And to do it, you have to start with it being an elimination game. And you have to start with the fact that it's got interest across all, not just political leanings, but also across all demographics. And it is very rare for any event to do that the way the Super Bowl does.
It is very hard to do, but everything comes together. And yes, I assume that there's some number of people, it's the only game they watch the entire year, but they don't want to be left out. That's a pretty great place to be for a live event, which is that 50% of the country does not want to be left out. It leads me to a slightly different discussion, which is if half the country is watching your game and they're watching it for free, how many of those people would pay a big sum of money to watch the game?
And we talked about, and you've kind of floated this notion before of perhaps the Super Bowl being a pay-per-view event, which I look at 113 million people. I look at the NFL largely being available on broadcast television, which you could theoretically buy a $29 piece of hardware and watch at any time. But you seem to think that there could be a financial future where the NFL looks towards the Super Bowl and says, we could be making a lot more money off of this.
Why wouldn't they? I mean, if you just assume that half of the people watched would still figure out a way to watch, if it costs $200, $250 for a household, you're just going to have more of what David said. You're going to have bigger parties, which is, I don't know how many households, I assume half the households in the United States watched. If it was only a quarter of the households who were willing to pay $250 to have a party at their house, it would still get you into the billions of dollars for a single game. And that is the single best way I can think of for the NFL to increase their annual revenue take for their clubs, is to make the Super Bowl a pay-per-view event.
How quickly would you say no when the NFL comes to you to renew your broadcast deal and you get regular season games, and sometimes they're good, you can flex a few good ones toward the end of the year, but come Super Bowl time, not only are you not in the rotation, but you'll never be in the rotation. You will never be able to do a Super Bowl game. And the NFL presents that to you. You say what?
I say, I don't want to do that, but do I get up from the table and say, that's a game changer? I'm not doing it. You're not going to get me. I'm in charge of NBC, CBS, Fox, or ESPN, who are the first to get a Super Bowl. Amazon didn't walk away from their package because they didn't get a Super Bowl. YouTube TV didn't walk away from their package because they didn't get a Super Bowl. It's a 10-year deal. 3 of the parties, which is NBC, CBS, and Fox, get 3 Super Bowls. 1 of the parties gets 2. That actually adds up to 11, so my math is wrong. But
we were just going to let you go because I ran out of fingers, but you're doing great.
But my point is, none of the current rights holders in the average year gets a game. The best anybody does is about once every 3.5 years. And it's a bonanza. It's a boon. But nobody gets up from the table and doesn't renew their package next time because they don't get a Super Bowl.
So are you telling me when you did the math of what the broadcast was worth, of what the rights were worth for you, you do not look at the Super Bowl or being in the rotation as having any added value whatsoever?
No, it does have added value, but it's not, you're not adding up mathematics and deciding that, oh, at this point, I can't do it. It is seminal. CBS cannot get its retransmission consent fees if they don't have a Super Bowl. And that was proved a few years ago when they were out of service for at least one of the big distributors, and that deal was settled on the eve of their NFL opener. So they can't do the math that says, gee, if I only have regular season games, how many people are going to cancel their subs? Because that's how they're paying for it.
But John, how much of the NFL's current success is attributable to the fact that they prioritize broadcast television? They prioritize access. They have yet to put a Super Bowl. I mean, we're talking about pay-per-view. They haven't put it on cable. They haven't put it on streaming. I mean, that's several steps beyond. Does the NFL not think to themselves, we are this big because anyone can watch our product?
That has traditionally been their point of view publicly. But the last 2 packages they sold a package to Amazon. They are very happy with that package, despite the fact that the ratings for those games went down, and they just put Sunday Ticket on YouTube TV. So they're already getting used to the fact that everything we do does not have to be on broadcast.
We would actually sit in a room, John and Witty, and we would talk about one of the problems with our playoff package, with MLB's playoff package, is that there's a lot of different networks. Like during the wild card round and the division series in the old days, you didn't know what channel you had to go to. And there was a big push when MLB Network started to get the word out there, what channel it is on your local cable provider. Where is the network? If you don't have the network, call your cable company and complain. And what you're seeing now is a complete shift away from that, where owners don't sit around trying to figure out the easiest way to get the most people and the fastest way to get them to a certain channel. They're doing the math right now and realizing that streaming, it's going to be, and it is now, where the money is. And if you think for a minute, and John, you call this and you get all the credit for it, and it doesn't make too many people in your industry happy. But the fact is that from an ownership standpoint, we're not going to be giving away the rights to these games for decades to come. We want them back. Much like MLB and all these leagues want their streaming rights back from all of you kind of people, we're trying to get the jewel events back because we know that you're going to pay up for the regular season in the NFL, and we can monetize the postseason, and we can go a step further. We can make the Super Bowl at a neutral site. We can sell it as pay-per-view, put it streaming, put it behind a paywall that we control. And then we can make the conference championship games, turn that into a Super Bowl, and make that the jewel event for our broadcast partners. And as you just said perfectly, there's not one damn thing you can do about it.
Yeah. The rights and the distribution of those rights is governed by where the most money can be generated. So the NFL had the luxury and the power and the appeal to say, we don't need to go past the broadcast networks, because it's also a good public posture. We're the People's League, but they have never sold anything that I know of for less money in order to keep it the People's League.
You don't think so, John? Because I mean, you had Monday Night Football for a long time when you were the president of ESPN. How much more would you have paid than a broadcast network to get a Super Bowl on ESPN? Because you have told us before that you told the college football playoff there was one price for the college football playoff to appear on ABC, and there was another price for the college football playoff to appear on ESPN, and the ESPN price was much higher. Did you ever go to the league and say, if you put the Super Bowl on ESPN, we will pay you X amount, and that is X amount more than you will get from one of the broadcast networks to put the Super Bowl on broadcast television?
I never succeeded in getting a Super Bowl for ESPN because they didn't have to sell me a Super Bowl in order to get the biggest price. The price they got was directly correlated to the distribution fees, which I got for having the NFL. And when those were no longer correlated, which they weren't in the last deal, ESPN got the smallest increase and got Super Bowls. Wow, think about that. So no, I didn't have any way that it was their point of view, which they appropriately held because they could, was no, I don't have to sell you any Super Bowls in order to get the most money I can get out of you.
But you have to agree that that's changing now.
Yeah.
When you're at the table going forward, it's a totally different conversation than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Every time there's going to be a new round of rights deals for the NFL, they're going to have to figure out, how am I going to satisfy my owners and get a massive increase? I don't see, they now have six business partners. There probably aren't a lot of people left on the sidelines who want an NFL package and are willing to pay over $1 billion for it. So they're going to have to figure out a way to generate billions more revenue from their existing partners with their existing rights, or take those rights and monetize them themselves.
How big an argument did you have over term length? Because we would sit in meetings and talk about term length, and it's a very funny conversation for rich people to have. They're talking about locking in. It's like cost certainty. Let's do a 10-year deal. This way we can guarantee our revenue streams. We know exactly what the salary cap will be. We'll try to grow locally, maybe through organic ticket price increases, but we're locking in the national deals. And there would be people on the commissioner's side who would say, are you guys sure about that? Well, we don't want to give ourselves more work. If you have these deals come up more often, you're betting on yourself. And with the way the landscape's changing, the owners got more conservative recently, which is very interesting to me, because in their other businesses and in their other life, they're realizing they can't be as conservative because of what's going on with the way content is being distributed and engaged by the viewer and the client. So how big an argument and discussion was term on your side of the room versus our side?
I believe that ESPN was responsible for what is now the ordinary, which is the broadcaster wants to do the longest possible deal. And I have always felt that overwhelmingly the leagues would be better off to do shorter deals. With rights, it's like flipping your home, right? I mean, why would you lock into, I'm going to buy a house and I can't sell it for 10 years. And then the market goes up 20% a year on houses in your neighborhood and you can't sell it.
We're such suckers, because what you used to do is you would throw in upfront money. And this is what Fox did a lot of with its RSNs. They throw in upfront money so owners can sign an extra player or try to curtail some of their operating losses. And they sacrifice both term and increased rates over the years, right? It really is a high interest loan. I sat down with our owner, John, you would have loved this conversation. When we did a TV deal, I sat down and said, do you understand the cost of this capital? Do you have any idea how we are being screwed by Fox? And if you were there, you would have done the same screwing. And his answer was, but how can I sign Delgado? And my answer was, what? That's insanity. Why don't you take the money off your credit card and pay the 18.6%?
Yeah, the sports media is complicit in this and enables it. What is every deal that gets announced? What do they announce as the increase? The increase is the average annual of one deal over the other. It can be close to meaningless. If you make a 10-year deal and you have a 3% annual increase across that, it's the annual increase from the last deal is not that big. And nobody has ever done that, was to say, okay, what was the payment in the last year of this deal and the first year of the next deal? And it's usually like 25%. And then every year for 9 years, it's 3% or something like that. But it's announced as a 100% increase over the last deal, and the deals keep getting longer and longer. There's one guy, Jim Delaney. The Big Ten has no business getting as much money as the SEC. The SEC gets higher ratings. They're draw more television ratings. But Jim Delaney at the at the Big Ten was the one guy who stuck to, even though he was the first guy, he did a 10-year deal with me, by the way, which I think was the first double-digit year deal across major sports, because we paid $100 million times 10, $1 billion.
What a sucker.
No, it was
another one, John. Who haven't you suckered in our industry?
It was a smart business deal because his constituency wanted to be the college conference that got the first $1 billion deal.
That's vanity, that's ego, and David, like to your point, sports owners cannot help themselves but being sports fans. Like, I love that, like, owners are making dumb business decisions that they would never do in any other area of business, because at heart they just want a good first baseman. They just want a good first baseman.
True. Look, it's something for a future show, but there is a great move for U.S. equity firms and foreign sovereign wealth funds to put in money to a league. All they're doing is capitalizing, literally, on the fact that the owners want an infusion of cash because they want to compete next year. Why is it happening in Serie A? They can't keep up with the English Premier League. Somebody's going to loan them money so they can keep up next year, and they're just going to be further behind. We have to pay the interest on that loan or pay it back.
You said something interesting that I don't want to let pass, which is the increase is what's announced. And I actually viewed it from my room as the opposite. We liked, because I was the Jim Delaney, the sucker, right, with the fish hook right in my mouth. Hey, we got $1 billion. Yeah, it's over 10 years. Or you do a $10 billion deal if you're the NFL. But what they're not saying is that the last deal was $9.4 billion. And so what's the actual increase? Baseball just did this. They made this huge announcement. They got everyone ready. They assigned people to go talk to the media. They planted stories in sports media and sports business about their huge broadcast deals. But the difference per team was like $4 or $5 million, right? It was some ridiculously small amount, but they got to announce big numbers. When we were negotiating with Fox, we would always talk about the notional amount because that's how we wanted to announce it, because our owner was so excited. As exactly you were saying, Witty, it's so insane. So excited to say, we just got $1 billion TV deal. It's ridiculous. And John, you know it. The problem I have with you is this going in. So it's not even a fair negotiation when people negotiate with you.
But it's why this area of business is so unique and fun to talk about as we do on this podcast, because there is something inside of everyone who participates in it that is doing a bad business transaction because of vanity. Either, you run a sports team and you want to be able to say we won a championship or we signed that player or we won free agency, but it ended up being bad business. Or you run a sports TV network and you want to have a specific sport on your air because you can help grow. Not everything is made of sound business mind always.
And you know what owners don't realize is that you work your entire career to win a championship, and the next day it's over. And you have to start again. And you've got all those players signed to deals. You've got all those undervalued broadcast deals that you've done because you needed upfront money. And just look at like the Washington Nationals. They won the World Series in 2019. That's only 4 seasons ago, basically yesterday. Now they're a bottom feeder. They can't get their team sold. And nobody even thinks about the fact that they just won a World Series. They just view them as having the worst farm system and the worst major league team. And the owners don't get one break, one benefit, one anything. However, what people like John Skipper always know is that the owners will never have a different outlook. They'll always play for the now because they think that feeling. I liken world championships, and I've said this to owners, it's like a hit of crack. Not that I've done crack, but it feels really good, so I'm told. And then the feeling goes away super fast, and you spend the rest of your life trying to get that feeling again, and you end up stealing from somebody's house to get it. And that's what sports ownership is.
Yeah, I would only shape that in one way, which is that the rise, you have to ask, Chris, you were saying they're making bad business decisions. The question is, what is their business? I would argue that their business is presiding over an asset which almost no matter what they do will appreciate, and that appreciation has covered pretty much all the so-called bad business decisions because the clubs just get worth more and more and more money. The business is not making money from year to year. The business is from presiding over your asset value, trying to get as many bragging rights as you can because you've won things. It has very little effect on your business. The New York Knicks are extraordinarily valuable. And last time I checked, they last won a championship in 1973 when the team was probably worth, you probably could have bought it for $25 million. And it now is easily a $7.5 billion acquisition to buy the New York Knicks.
Did you know that Jeffrey Lurie, the owner of the Marlins, was offered a chance to become George Steinbrenner's partner with the Yankees about 30 years ago for a enterprise value that was nothing? It was not even $100 million. And the reason why he turned it down is because part of the deal with George, as they were going through documents and doing partnership agreements, is that Jeffrey was not allowed to be involved in baseball decisions. And he was so pissed off. He's like, this is horseshit. I'm not doing this. I want to sign a first baseman, damn it. And so he didn't buy the Yankees.
Yeah. By the way, who wouldn't? Remember, Mark Cuban once said something to the effect, I may misquote him, that I would rather win championships and lose money than make money and lose.
God, that is like a union's dream. Literally. That's on their marketing material. We need more owners like that. The math is actually interesting because money that you lose operationally, you can actually quantify. The money that you're making in terms of asset appreciation is really how good a salesman the president is. So I would have to tell our owner, hey, we lost $28 million, but I promise you our team went up by $75 million this year. Forget Forbes because they don't know anything, but this is what I'm telling you, that I could sell a team for X plus 75. Therefore, your reallocation of assets was worthwhile. You spent 28 to gain 75. But the problem is the 28 is real and the 75 is this sort of ephemeral thing that you can't see, smell, touch, or taste, and you don't get the payoff until you sell the team. And now with the teams getting more and more expensive, you're seeing more teams changing hands, but you're also seeing at the very top teams like the Cowboys, let's say, saying, I don't think I'm ever going to sell. But of course, I don't believe him because everything is for sale. Even Jim Dolan said he's ready to take a minority partner. That made me smile too.
Yeah.
David.
Well, that's the next step. That allows you to have your cake and eat it too, right? The problem with, I have to sell my asset to feel like I've made smart business decisions but I lose my Porsche, I lose my Rembrandt in the living room if I have to sell the team. Well, let's sell 40% of the team so I can buy some Rembrandts and some Porsches and still sit in the front row.
That's why there's new rules in sports, by the way, where the principal owner, the controlling owner, has to own a specific percentage and has to be the highest. In the NBA, the controlling owner has to own over 15% and own the most of any of the other partners. MLB is doing the same sort of thing after the Bruce Sherman deal in Miami, where there were 1 million owners and it became an issue when capital calls started. So these rules are interesting, and why you're seeing richer and richer billionaires buying these teams and try not to syndicate them.
David, we have other things we want to get to, but I want to ask you something because you mentioned it. I think a lot of people read Forbes Evaluations and put stock into it, and you say they know nothing. Why?
Yeah, they don't. They have no numbers, Chris.
Okay, so like for example, it was reported that LAFC are the first MLS team valued at $1 billion. Is that they're just inventing that? Like, what are the Forbes valuations based on?
I've had more fights with the people from Forbes, and then I just stopped because it's not worth it. Because then I decided I have a better plan. When my view of my team is that the team is worth less than what Forbes says, then Forbes knows what they're talking about. When my view is that it's worth more than what Forbes says, then they are idiots. So it all depended from year to year what my public stance would be. And if you go back and look at quotes over the years, that's exactly what you'll find is an inconsistency. All of that said, there is no rhyme or reason. They claim they have revenue numbers, but they get snippets of papers and they get it on the black market because they don't get access to the actual team numbers and they don't know anything about what the value of the team is, what the operating income is. They try to talk about EBITDA and operating income and net gain or net loss, but they don't have the full statements. And one of the things that fascinates me is when there's leaks of these statements, like happened to me when our statements got leaked and it was only partial statements for only 2 of the years, which doesn't give a complete picture. The Astros statements got leaked as part of a new book called Winning Fixes Everything. But again, those statements are not complete. So Forbes doesn't have the full picture. Therefore, they put a multiple on it without actually putting an ego premium, which is truly the entire value of the team is based on ego premium, not on a multiple of revenue. That's my 10 cents on that, John and Chris.
Thank you, David. Want to move now to some broadcaster stories. So we just talked about the Super Bowl from a viewership standpoint, but the broadcasting element of it was interesting. So we had the first Super Bowl for Fox with Kevin Burkhardt and Greg Olson in the booth. They have drawn rave media critic reviews. I myself thought they did a very good job, although my opinion doesn't probably very much matter. But John, there's sort of the looming story of Tom Brady, who told Colin Cowherd that he will not be beginning his broadcasting career until 2024. And that creates this dynamic of, well, is Burkhardt and Olsen going to be a team for one more year? Is Olsen eventually going to be bumped down to number 2, which reportedly will see his salary decrease by $7 million? What do you think is going through the minds of the Fox executives right now?
Gee, don't leave it to me to decipher what's going through the minds of Fox executives.
I am leaving it to you. That's our show.
I'm not actually going to decide that. I don't know what's going through their minds, but I have been consistent and will make the same point again. It is not a financial decision as to who you put in the booth, and it barely matters. Didn't we just talk about the Super Bowl and record ratings and more people watching than ever? And last year, if this game had been on Fox, it would have included what many people considered the best booth in football. It would have been Joe Buck and Troy Aikman. Instead, it was Kevin Burkhardt, who wasn't even the number 1 broadcaster on Fox last year, and Matt Olson. And they got record ratings. Would one more person have watched if it was Troy Aikman and Joe Buck? No. So Fox managed to save a whole lot of money, get record ratings, and now they're dealing with another non-issue, which is when do we put Tom Brady on? First of all, I would posit that maybe Tom Brady has decision-making problems and just keeps putting things off to the next year. And it doesn't matter if Tom Brady's going to be in the booth. They're on the hook to pay him, $350 million, something like that over 10 years. And truth be told, they're probably okay if he puts this decision off year after year after year, as long as they have him under contract and he can't go on anywhere else.
I've never viewed you as ordinary, John, but you just proved your point without realizing it. You referred to the analyst last night during the Super Bowl as Matt Olson, who happens to be the first baseman for the Braves. Greg Olson, and your point is perfect because if we asked 100 million out of the 113 million viewers, they would say, yes, was that Merlin Olsen? Who was that announcer exactly? So you said famously that nobody should be paying these broadcaster salaries the way the salaries have increased because no one tunes in for a broadcaster. CBS started the trend by paying Romo, and that caused a huge sort of avalanche of broadcaster salaries and movement when you had Buck and Aikman move, you had Al Michaels move, and all these people are moving for money. And then you have an issue with broadcast networks who say to themselves, we can't believe what Skipper says because we've got to tell our investors. We have to explain why we have the expenses we have. So I don't think as president of ESPN, you were ever willing to say that it doesn't matter who's in the booth. I would argue that it is only given your current position that you're willing to take that position. And I'm curious if you are willing ever to agree with what I'm saying. Have you ever thought differently about announcers?
Yes, and my comment may be slightly broad, and I would narrow it to say that who's in the booth does not matter relative to viewership. It might matter a tiny bit relative to financial value because these are trophies. These are ways for broadcast executives to brag that we have Tom Brady, we have Troy Aikman, we have Tony Romo. It does matter to them spiritually that they have what they regard as a good booth. But truth be told, if the best booth was an announcer you never heard of and a very obscure player, those broadcasters would be brushed aside in a moment for Tom Brady or Derek Jeter or Troy Aikman because they want a big name. If you can find a big name who also happens to be good at it, cue Tony Romo before this season when it got so bad they had to have a so-called intervention with him. We could talk about that if you want to. It matters for bragging rights, for telling your advertisers you're the best in the business, for telling your broadcast stations you've got somebody great. It doesn't matter for finances. Did I ever think about it? Yeah, I put Tony Kornheiser in the Monday Night Football booth because I was trying to re-stoke the Howard Cosell fire, right? And find somebody who would be entertaining and fun. And yeah, I hope that might lead to viewers. I also sometimes simply wanted to make statements. I thought Jessica Mendoza was great on a baseball game. And did I care about being the first network to put a woman in a weekly game broadcast? I do. And I think that had value for our reputation and for who we were and for diversity and inclusion. So Hugh Tucker Carlson, who can now talk about woke Skipper. And we did it for that because I did understand it would not make a bit of difference. And so anybody who's not participating in putting the best people in there, they should put the best people in there. And it's not going to be Tom Brady or
how quickly
Derek
did
Jeter.
you know that Kornheiser wasn't going to work out? How many minutes into game one were you told by either someone else or in your own head that you had a problem? Because I promise you, I believe I can say that you watched his first game in the booth.
I did watch his first game in the booth. I understood in preseason that I did not have buy-in from the people producing the game and from the other people in the booth to Tony being in the booth, and that they would freeze him out and they would marginalize him and it wouldn't work. And I was stubborn enough to stick with it and try to make it work for, I think, 2 seasons, but I can't remember. It could have been 3.
But you were stubborn because it was your idea? You were stubborn because you thought it was the right thing to do?
Well, I'm not good enough of a person to separate those two things always. I thought it was the best idea, and it was my idea. So, yes, I am probably guilty of, but by the way, because I didn't come from an Ebersolian background of having spent my whole life doing broadcast television, I had the flexibility to think outside the box. I had the inexperience to get it wrong.
Why didn't you fire the
I got it
producers?
wrong.
Why didn't you fire the producers and the people who were not allowing your experiment to even have a shot coming out of the gate? Because you certainly had the power to do that, and you could have replaced the entire crew, and you could have done it in 2 seconds.
I could have, and I probably didn't have the confidence because of the lack of experience I'd had doing that. So I was not willing to do that. Did
the same thing happen with Jessica?
No.
Everyone bought into that.
I don't know that everyone bought into it. In fact, I know some people didn't buy into it, but it wasn't as disruptive to the to the sports gods, right? Putting Tony Kornheiser in there was offensive to the sports gods because they believe that it's a controlled universe. And don't you love if you haven't played the game, you really can't understand. It's like, great. So if I'm not Dostoevsky, I can't read a novel. But with Jessica, she did know the game. She had played it, so she had that level of credibility. So, and we're a few years further down the line. I had more confidence. And in that case, I said, I don't want to have a discussion. That's what we're going to do.
Do you know what a problem it was for us as a team that you put Jessica in the booth?
I did not.
Yeah. So at the time, I don't know if you recall this, she worked for a team. Remember that?
She worked for the Mets.
And for us.
For the Mets, right?
And we had our baseball people come up to us and say, we don't want her in the clubhouse. She cannot have access. It had nothing to do with sex. I promise you that. It had only to do with the competitiveness and the insanity that baseball people feel that she would go in and have information that would help an NL East rival.
Oh, interesting.
It took a lot of time, and we actually asked the commissioner to get you to take her out of the booth.
Really?
How'd that go over?
I didn't. I don't think I ever got that call.
I assume you put it to voicemail.
I want to ask you, though,
I can assure you that if the commissioner called me, it did not go to voicemail. And
I can assure you that a commissioner wouldn't have called you on that issue. It would have been one of the people in the other departments.
Yeah.
I do want to talk, though, a little bit more about this kind of broadcaster element, because you mentioned the Tony Romo intervention. The one thing that I find curious as someone who, frankly, wants to be a play-by-play broadcaster is, number one, the notion of performance review, which is, can we not discuss the manner in which you do your job without it seeming like an intervention? Why is broadcasting the only job in which your boss calls you and says, hey, can we talk about how you do your job? And it's a headline in the New York Post. I feel like any other profession, you just talk about job performance. And second, I guess as it relates Brady, and even Derek Jeter was announced as moving to Fox. What is the ultimate balance between the quality with which one does their job and their fame? Meaning, why are sometimes the scales more tipped towards who the person is rather than the job they can do?
Well, John, can I give you 1 second on this? Because I need you to answer this in full. I can only say that as a fan, there are very few fans who actually understand what's being said anyway in terms of analysis, and it doesn't matter to them. They're gambling or doing fantasy or they're at a party or whatever they're doing. And so I think that fame is, and to the extent it means anything, which we've agreed on this show doesn't mean anything, but fame, the name, is far more important than what comes out of the mouth. But with Romo, there's such a big investment in him, and it moved the market so much that I think that's what caused it. John, where are you on that?
Well, I want to say one thing first, which is the word intervention is unfair here. And I'm using it because I'm looking at the story that ran in the New York Post in which they used the word intervention. Intervention has an implication that there is some significant problem and you had to intervene because the person was unwilling to do it. I'm assuming it was ordinary course of review in which they did call him in and have some review of how well he'd done his job, and somebody leaked that. And it's a good way to get a number of people to click on the story that they tried to intervention with Tony Romo. So having made that one point, I've lost the train of the question you asked me.
What for you is the ultimate balance between the quality of a broadcaster's work and their fame? And also, why is it so offensive that a broadcaster's boss wants to talk to them about the quality of the work that they're doing?
To me, there's very little correlation between the quality of the work you get and the level of fame. The ideal combination is the most famous possible person who's the best announcer. But that very seldom happens, right? And often, of course, it's like the best players don't make the best coaches for the most part. It usually is that player who was a role player and had time to think about studying the game. And it is often the case that the best announcers are people who weren't the best players. It doesn't correlate very much. does happen that maybe the best guy who did color in our lifetime in football was John Madden, who was a successful coach and ended up being more famous as an announcer than a coach. That doesn't happen very often. I can't think of anybody who was a superstar who became more famous as an announcer. Charles Barkley, maybe. That is the ideal combination of fame and expertise at television.
How about Troy Aikman? We've talked about him. If you ask people who are 25 years old, Troy Aikman is the NFL analyst. He's not the Super Bowl winning quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys. That happened before they were born. I mean, we forget how the years are passing. We're almost a quarter through this century. And Aikman was last century, as far as I recall. It might as well have been before there were cars. So it can happen. But I think the Romo intervention, they called it that because when Romo first started, he came out of nowhere. And he had this great appeal because he had the playbook of the other teams that he was calling out what was going to happen before it was going to happen. And you had teams actually tuning in to see what the other team was thinking. I mean, it was total insanity. And then he just sort of became a little lazier after he signed his contract. And the intervention, I think, was based on how hard it is to be an analyst. And one of the things that when you're hiring people, I know you tell them, you can't just show up at work. Tom Brady cannot show up to week 1 and all of a sudden be a analyst for the NFL. It doesn't work that way. You have to work your ass off. So when he says, I retired to spend more time with my family, now I'm going to join Fox, it's a joke. You're away every weekend, right? Literally every weekend is a different place. You're schlepping all over the country, and you have to study and know all the teams. You meet with coaches and players. I think the Tom Brady thing, I don't even think you asked this, Witty, but I'm just on a roll about this because I'm angry that he got that contract. It's a joke. It's only because of who he is, not because of what he can do. He's never even called a damn game. I don't even know if he can put 3 sentences together to make a paragraph.
He's also like not ever been like a great quote. Like Charles Barkley was a really good, giver of press conference, but Tom Brady has been guarded on purpose. We've posited on the show that the one reason why I think he could be good is because he's very competitive, and he probably looks at everyone else who's doing well in the broadcasting game, and even what's happening right now with Greg Olsen, where Greg Olsen has become something of a media darling in these last couple weeks with how well he's done in the NFC Championship and the Super Bowl. And even Kevin Burkhardt has come out and said, I'm not thinking about Tom Brady. And there's some perceived slight that can come towards Tom Brady, and he sort of competes his way into being good at broadcasting. Otherwise, you have no indication that he'd be good at it other than his enormous fame and success as a quarterback.
You better be willing to talk, like what Fox just did when they announced great crossover for baseball. That was huge for baseball. During the Super Bowl pregame, having Derek Jeter announced as part of the Fox baseball team. I really enjoyed that, notwithstanding that I don't enjoy anything that Jeter does. But that said, other than agree to prices, that said, Derek Jeter as an analyst makes me laugh. And he's not going to be in the booth. He's going to be doing pre and post game. I'm waiting for him, and John and I were talking pre-show about this. I am waiting for him to say one interesting thing, and I believe that I will find Godot before that happens.
All right, one last thing we want to cover before we wrap this thing up, and that is what's going on at Disney right now. Disney had an earnings call last week, and Bob Iger, the returning CEO, announced some very interesting things about the future of how they're going to handle streaming, how ESPN is going to be separated from its linear channel unit, and it's going to be its own business. John, there are some things in an article I read in Variety, among other places, that would signal what's going on in the future of Disney, but with my lack of business expertise, I couldn't really decipher what they were. What did you make of what Iger said and what ultimately is happening with this business?
I think it bears noting that he said this during an earnings call. And an earnings call is a particular version of kabuki theater in which the CEO of the company has a ethical obligation to tell the truth, the legal obligation not to provide specific forward data that she or he knows is not accurate. I know that Bob Iger, as a CEO, understands all those things, but his most important job in that call is to assure the people who own the stock that he has a plan that's going to deliver them returns in the future. And so what he's telling you about ESPN is truth, but it's also intended to make the shareholders happy. So what did he tell them? We're not going to spin ESPN off. So he doesn't think that the shareholders in this case, other than that one activist whose name I can't remember right now, really want him to spin ESPN off. Two, he believes it because he knows that ESPN provides the cash that he needs in the theme parks and the entertainment business, which requires you to make things and pay them for them before you get paid. ESPN, you get paid, requires no cash up front. And so that he also told them that ESPN would have to be, might have to be more selective in terms of what rights they bought. So he's telling the truth. They're always selective about the rights they buy because you can't buy everything. But he's also assuring them that we're not going to make big, expensive rights deals that you think will not be prudent. However, when the NBA comes along, he will make a big, expensive rights deal. And when the new college football playoff goes from 4 to 16 and they do a new deal, he will make a big, expensive sports claim because he can also tell the truth and say, these are good for our business.
Being on linear TV used to be a thing, and people would talk about what channel are you on and that you have your own TV show. And what you're seeing going forward is that the line between digital and streaming and over the air, it's going to sort of meld into one. And when you do an earnings call like that and you announce the 3 pillars and you call ESPN a pillar, what you're really saying is, not only, sorry, Dan, no more when Le Batard joins us again. He can't ask anymore, what would ESPN be worth if it gets sold? It's his favorite question to ask. I don't know why. Maybe he's trying to sort of look back on any options you may have had, but it's not. He made it pretty clear that ESPN is not being sold. But when you're saying that on an earnings call, that you then want the news baked into your analyst forecasts, because that's what the earnings call are for. There are Wall Street analysts who give a buy, a sell, or a hold to their institutional clients and to their individual clients, and you want people buying your stock. So you are trying to get news out there that will help bolster the stock price. All of that said, with the way the world is changing and the speed in which it's changing, I didn't take Bob Iger's comments that ESPN is not being sold, it's not being spun off, it's way too important to us. I don't think that that necessarily means that that's the case in 2, 4, or 10 years, because the type of asset they have, it's not really core to quote unquote Disney. And the reason why the activist investor Nelson Peltz got involved, amongst many reasons that he gets involved, is that when you look at Disney Parks and Disney Entertainment, it is a wholly different business that has different financials, has different ways that revenue is generated than ESPN, where you're not buying rights fees, as an example. You're not spending money that you can't explain really that well when your dip is not so significant as ESPN's dip is in terms of subs and fees. So I think we're just starting, John, on this subject. So I don't think that we can take a victory lap that ESPN's not going to be sold, or Dan can take a victory lap that it's going to be sold. I think what this earnings call did was sort of quash the conversation, put a pin in it for a future time in order to sort of ease the investors currently. That was my takeaway.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. You heard me say I don't think it will occur in the next 2 years. I don't think there's a contemplation to sell ESPN. I'm interested because you understand this world better than I do. So the activist investor's name is Nelson Peltz.
Nelson Peltz.
So do I misunderstand this? I believe that he became an activist after he bought $1 billion worth of stock.
I mean, listen, that's
he has
the definition.
one motivation and one motivation only. I don't think he's in the altruistic business of let me help you out because I know what to do with Disney. He's in the business of I took $1 billion of my investors' money and I put it in Disney stock. The stock is now up, I think, 5, 6, 7, 8% because he got everybody's attention. I don't assume he's going to hold that for the next 12 years. He just made a bunch of money for himself and his investors. I don't think he did anything in bad faith. He didn't do anything that the SEC can get involved in. He bought $1 billion worth of stock. He took that risk.
Well, that's what people do, right? We say activists. It doesn't mean they walk around with a picket sign talking about being pro-choice or anti-choice. Activist investors are people who have enough of a position in a company that they want a seat at the table. That's really what they're talking about, is they want to be involved in the decisions that are made. And Disney doesn't take necessarily kindly to someone coming in and saying, I'd like to be involved in what colors Mickey's ears are going to be. So what you do is you have to deal with these activist investors. You have to pacify them by doing what you're supposed to do anyway. That's the joke of activist investors to me. Your job, Bob Iger has one job, not to make ESPN a pillar. Who cares? His job is for the stock price to keep going up at a rate that outperforms the market. I assume that's his only job description, right? I mean, I would hope that's his only job description.
I would quarrel a little bit. I think he also has as his job description growing the overall enterprise value, protecting the assets and the brand reputation for the long run. And that, I actually think where CEOs do a bad job is when the only thing they're worried about is the next earnings call and making sure the earnings go up. Bob actually has always been able to do both.
I appreciate your love of him. I would tell you that the majority, listen, I'm not commenting on your personal life. I am merely saying that if you ask 10 CEOs, 9.5 out of 10 would tell you that they worry about the next earnings call.
Oh, I agree with that. They do. They have to. It doesn't mean that those CEOs who do the best 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, 10-year tenure have to think beyond that.
John, there's so much content here. We could keep going. We always run out of time here, Witty. We do all this prep. We have all these topics and the time just flies. We're like, we may need a 6th topic. We didn't even get to the 4th one yet.
Yeah.
We're going to have to save it.
That's how you know it was a good show, though. So very much appreciate the time, guys. Again, David Samson, check him out. Nothing Personal with David Samson, wherever you get podcasts. Also on the CBS Sports HQ family of channels, and John Skipper, the CEO of Meadowlark Media. Check out all Meadowlark Media podcasts and documentary projects. As thanks for him coming on and doing this with us. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, David.
See you later, guys.